Okay, now. Hello, this is Cerebrovascular, Lecture 3 of Neuroanatomy, and this is Video C. So now that we know where we are now going to talk about the vertebrovascular system. So we talked about the internal carotid system in the previous video, and now we're going to talk about the system that supplies more posterior regions of the brain. So to remind you, it comes up through this vertebral artery, and it's going to ascend up here, and so we're going to be talking about this part starting back here in more detail, which I'm sure you all will love. So if you can get out your handouts again, so all the ones that are already up there, we already went through. Those numbers are part of the internal carotid system, and we're going to put on new numbers for the vertebrovascular system. So I got bored when I was making this, so I'm sorry, you're going to have to put up with my animations. Let's go for 6. 6, these are the vertebral arteries. And so there's 2 of them. It's only labeled here, but this is a vertebral artery, and this is a vertebral artery. There's going to be branches of other arteries coming off of those that I'll talk about in a minute. But right now I want you to notice that these 2 vertebral arteries come, and as they ascend, they're going to fuse. And they're going to fuse into the basilar artery. So that 7 is the basilar artery. Yeah, I'm just going to put artery. And that is going to run along the anterior surface of the pons. So just to let you know, that's where it is. So here we have it on that diagram over here. And here we have our vertebral arteries coming up here and fusing, and here's our basilar artery. And you can tell this area under here is the pons. So the next thing we have is number 8. So these are arteries that are coming off of those vertebral arteries. And this is called the posterior inferior cerebellar artery. So some of you are thinking, God, what a horrible name that I'm going to have to remember. But it helps you because it's telling you exactly what it supplies. It's going to supply the posterior inferior cerebellum. So that's important. Unfortunately for you, though, it's also going to supply parts of the medulla. You'll see this sometimes abbreviated as PICA, P-I-C-A, for posterior inferior cerebellar artery. Please note that on exams you need to write out the whole thing. PICA will not get you full credit. You need to write out posterior inferior cerebellar artery. And make sure you're saying cerebellar, not cerebral. Okay, so that's that one. Now we have number 9. 9 is the, oopsie, I need to put my thingy. 9. So 9 arises as these 2 branches that are going to come off the vertebral arteries here. They're going to send off branches, and these branches are going to fuse, and they are going to form the anterior spinal artery. So that is going to descend, as you can tell, along the anterior surface of the spinal cord. Number 10 is shown here. 10 is also going to come off of these vertebral arteries. In some cases, though, it can come off of PICA and down here. So that's that one, posterior spinal artery. But it could also come directly off of that vertebral artery. So this is the posterior spinal artery. And let me say it can come off vertebral artery or off of pica, so the posterior inferior cerebellar artery, as shown in the diagram. As you can imagine, this is going to supply posterior spinal cord. And you can tell that from the name, so that's nice. And then we have 11. 11 is coming off of, well, you can see where it is. This is, I guess I'll write it down here, the anterior inferior cerebellar artery. Sometimes abbreviated as ICA, and that's going to supply the anterior inferior cerebellum. And also some regions of the pons. So that's that. And now number 12, we have these little arteries that are coming off of the basilar artery over here, and these are called the pontine arteries. And they're going to supply the pons, as indicated by the name. All of a sudden, this fuzzy thing is like right in my field of view. Is it? I don't know what it is. It's kind of weird having this fuzz ball. Okay, 13. 13 is the superior cerebellar artery. Cerebellar artery. And so that one is the most anterior. As you come up through the vertebrobasilar system, that's going to come off here. And there's going to be two sides to it. And this is going to supply superior aspects of the cerebellum, as indicated by the name. So then we have I'll go over there and put the number up in a minute, but while I'm here, the posterior cerebral artery. So PCA, you might see that sometimes. This has both cortical and deep branches. Actually, I'll put the number up there while I'm writing this stuff so you know what I'm talking about. There's 14. You probably guessed which one it was, but there it is. So the cortical branches are going to supply posterior and inferior cerebral hemispheres. Cerebral hemisphere areas, and they're also going to supply parts of temporal and occipital lobes. And the deep branches, I'll just write it down here, the deep branches of this posterior cerebral artery are going to supply parts of the thalamus. So this slide shows you the spinal cord, and we're going back to this anterior spinal artery and this posterior spinal artery. So in lab and on exams, you'll be expected to identify the anterior and the posterior aspects of the parts of the spinal cord. And you can actually easily do this just based on these arteries, because our posterior spinal arteries are going to divide and come down. There's going to be two of them one on each more lateral region of the spinal cord. In contrast, if we're looking at the anterior view of the spinal cord, we're just going to have a single midline artery coming down. So those arteries can give you clues as to which part of the spinal cord you're looking at, anterior versus posterior. And that's shown also in this diagram. So our anterior spinal artery is going to run medially, and then our posterior is going to have two spinal arteries that are offset from the midline. This shows you a summary of the arterial supply of the medial surface, as the title says. So let me take you through that. Here is our vertebral arteries coming up. They're ascending. There's going to be two of them. Only one of them is shown on this slide. They're going to fuse to form the basilar artery, which runs along the surface of the pons. There we have our pontine arteries coming off. We can see other areas as we go more anteriorly here. We have the anterior communicating artery here. And then we have, this is the medial surface. So this is going to be our anterior cerebral artery that's going to go to supply these medial regions of the cerebral hemispheres. And then if we go back to this area, we can see our anterior inferior cerebellar artery there, as well as our posterior inferior cerebellar artery right there. This also has some sinuses on it, well, parts of some of the sinuses, to get you also oriented with the arteries relative to some of the sinuses that we've talked about in class. This is a figure from your Nolte textbook. You also want to look at Nolte Table 6-1. As we go through the course, you're going to need to know the blood supply for specific regions that we go through. And so keep this figure in mind. Check back at this figure. So at the bottom here, it has color coding. So the area supplied by the anterior cerebral artery, for example, is this kind of medium purple colored. So you can see it both on these horizontal sections here, what area it supplies, as well as these coronal sections up here. So that can really help tell you what areas are supplied by which of the main arteries, which are listed down here. So that's the end of video 3 and the end of the cerebrovascular lecture. And that's all I have to tell you right now. I don't know what else to say. I'm done.